Good morning everyone, Bwyd ar pawb, croeso, welcome to this narrated PowerPoint for the induction session of module EDPM Additional Learning Needs and Inclusion Anghenion Dysgu Ychwanegol a Chynhwysiant. A couple of apologies for the session yesterday. It was a little bit disrupted in terms of the fire alarm going off before the session started, and also there were challenges where Panopto and Teams and Zoom refused to record the session when we started. So to make up for that, just to make sure that you've got the information, hopefully this narrated PowerPoint will suffice. So as a quick recap then, and first of all, it was lovely to meet so many of you in person yesterday, and I really look forward to working with you throughout the module. We went through some personal introductions, we introduced the module aims and learning outcomes, we thought a little bit about the module timetable and some of the topics that we will cover, and how we will discuss as a group towards the middle of the module what areas of needs and other areas linked to inclusion you might want to look at. We introduced the two module assignments, and then we did a brief exercise where we met some pupils by looking through some pen portraits and started to plan ahead to the session next week in terms of what we were going to cover, which is to think about key debates in additional learning needs and inclusion. So just as a quick recap for myself then. So as I said yesterday, I started off as a secondary school geography teacher and became a teacher because I wanted to make a difference in people's lives, quite naively I suppose. I used to teach geography, tipyn bach o Cymraeg, a little bit of Welsh and also history, and I did that in mainstream secondary schools for 7 years. I then spent a very unhappy year being a supply teacher before moving on to spend 10 years working in a pupil referral unit. And a pupil referral unit is a particular type of alternative provision which is put in place for learners who either have been permanently expelled or excluded from school or who are at risk of being so. Following that, I then spent 7 years working up in Wrexham University up in North Wales, in particular teaching across a range of different undergraduate and postgraduate modules linked to additional learning needs and inclusion, including training teaching assistants and teachers to become dyslexia specialists, and have been working at Swansea University since September 2022. We then spent a bit of time introducing ourselves using the Padlet, and if anyone wasn't able to join us at the session yesterday but would like to post something on there, if you're happy just to post your first name or what name you'd prefer me to call you by, what you hope to get out of study in the module, any experiences you have of ALN so far, and any experiences you have of inclusion so far. We then mentioned briefly some expectations, and we talked about the fact that personally I don't particularly like having a wide set of class rules as such. However, there are a number of things that I particularly believe in, which are we do not leave anyone behind as a group. We learn from and with each other. We listen to and value the opinions and experiences of every member of the group, as all of us bring prior learning and experiences that we can take away ourselves. And realistically, we treat each other with the respect and attitude that we would expect to be treated with ourselves. And finally, AEF, attend where possible, engage with the resources and feedback. In other words, tell me if there's something that you would prefer me to do differently or go over, for example. So as a brief introduction to the module, and the aim of the module is to engage in key debates around additional learning needs and inclusion. Now, I'm aware that ALN, additional learning needs, is the terminology that we use in Wales and have done since September 2021. However, we are looking potentially as well outside of Wales, thinking about special educational needs as the term that is used in many other countries, including England, for example. So we'll think a little bit about theory, we'll think critically about how we approach ALN both in Wales and in other countries internationally. We will hopefully look at examples of what research suggests is good or best practice. and therefore we will get a well-rounded understanding of both theory and practice in relation to ALN. In particular, then, we're going to consider three areas: inclusion, and as we said yesterday, inclusion doesn't just mean learners with ALN or special educational needs. Inclusion is everyone. We will look at some examples of ALN policy in Wales and be able to compare and contrast then policy and legislation to different countries, and we will look at best practice in ALN, and in particular we will work together as a group to decide what areas of ALN that you would like to cover. We mentioned yesterday potentially looking at those high incidence ALNs, in other words the ones that we are most likely to meet in the classroom. However, I'm open to discussion as we move through the module in terms of that. So in terms of the module aims, four aims then. So the module aims to equip students with a strong understanding of ALN in their context. Now again, speaking to you as a group yesterday, some of you are teachers, some of you are teaching assistants, some of you don't work in education and work in different settings. So the aim as we go through will be for you to be able to take that information and contextualise it within your own experiences and context. We will consider current developments within the national and international dimension. We will critically evaluate current policy and its impact on practice. So why have we moved away from 30 years of SEN policy in Wales to a new policy of ALN? What's prompted that? What impact does it hope to have on practice, for example? What impact does it seem to be having on practice? And we will also understand a number of specific additional learning needs and how these impact upon individuals. So for example, specific learning differences in dyslexia or autistic spectrum disorder, for example. In terms of the learning outcomes then, there are four learning outcomes. So you will be able to critically engage with debates around inclusion in education. You will analyse the strengths and weaknesses of ALN policy within their context. You will critically and creatively challenge current practice based on your knowledge and understanding of factors relating to ALN, and we will also identify and discuss a range of contentious ALN SEN issues. And as we go through the module, one of the things we will find is that there is no one right answer. There is no one-size-fits-all approach that will work to meet the needs of all learners. So just as a brief outline, and I've left this deliberately vague and we will build this as we go through the module, but here we've got our Monday sessions and roughly what it is we're going to look at within those sessions. So week 2, Monday the 5th of February, for example, we will introduce key debates in ALN and inclusion. Now you can see here on week 3, Monday the 12th of February, we've got an asterisk here and the letters RW. This week is classed as a reading week. So during this week there will be no expectation that you need to attend the session, and I will give you a task to complete in your own time on Canvas. However, I will be available in our usual room in our usual time slot if you want to come in to talk about anything in relation to the module or anything else that I may be able to help you with. So how will you be assessed on this module? So there are two assessment components. The first one sounds scarier than it is in reality, which is a 90-minute in-class test. And rather than having you come into campus for a different day of the week when you wouldn't normally be timetabled to come in, I suggest that we complete this task together on Monday the 18th of March during our normal session. And this test is worth 25% of the overall mark for the module, and it's an open book assessment. The majority of this assessment you will be able to prepare in advance and bring with you, and as we go through on the next slide you will update and make tweaks during the assessment itself in terms of your learning. And the second part of the assignment then is a 3,000-word essay, which is due in on the 26th of April, and this then counts for the remaining 75% of the module mark. So what does the in-class test involve? So this will be 90 minutes in length, and as I said, we will aim to complete this together on Monday the 18th of March. So what you will do, you will prepare a lesson plan, and I will give you a lesson plan template to follow at the end of the session next week. It's entirely up to you what topic you want to prepare a session on, and I need to remind you that this is a fictitious lesson. So you will prepare a lesson, but you will not be expecting to teach it. So you will make up a class of learners of whatever age that you would prefer. So this could be early years, primary, secondary, young adult, adult, entirely up to you. And you will pick a topic for your choice of lesson. On the lesson plan, for example, you will outline the class. So who are the learners in the fictitious class? What is the topic that you're going to teach them? You will come up with some learning outcomes. You will come up with a plan for what your lesson would entail. So how would you introduce the session? What would be the main activities that your learners would be doing? How would you finish the lesson? Would you set any homework, for example? How would you know that your learners have understood the information in your fictitious lesson? And you will also be asked to think in your lesson plan about how you are going to support inclusion. And in terms of inclusion, there are two key approaches that we will discuss over the next few weeks. One of these we can consider to be Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, and the purpose of UDL is to remove as many barriers as possible for all learners. So you might think in your classroom, for example, in your fictitious lesson, what might you do to take away some of the barriers that learners may be faced with in the session? The second approach is to think about reasonable adjustments. In other words, we are aware that there are barriers remaining in the classroom or within the subject or within the assessment, and what we're now going to do is to think about how we can help learners overcome the barriers that remain. And both of those approaches are appropriate. So you will bring your lesson plan with you. And during the in-class test, you will be presented with 3 separate one-page pupil profiles. And these will be similar to the learners that we looked at yesterday. So these pupil profiles will outline the learner's area of need, any particular strengths and interests that they exhibit, and also potentially any weaknesses that they experience. And you will be asked to go away and modify your plan and think about how you would include those 3 learners in the session. In addition to the lesson plan itself, you will also submit a 1,000-word justification, and within your justification you will outline and justify the methods and approaches you have decided to include in your lesson plan in terms of how you're going to teach it and how you're going to support learners with needs. The justification will need to be underpinned with links to references, and we will be in a computer room to do this in-class test, and you will have full access to Google and other search engines to be able to find information to back up and underpin the justification for your choices. So that's the first in-class assessment. The second assignment then is a more straightforward essay, and we've all written essays before, so perhaps we have a better understanding of what an essay entails. So for this 3,000 words, this counts for the remaining 75% of the mark, and you will choose from one of these 3 titles below. So you will either critically discuss the concept of inclusion, and we will start to unpick this concept together in class next week, or you will look at the importance of the environment in terms of additional learning needs. Now this might be the physical school environment or a classroom layout. It might be the environment linked to attitudes. It might be the environment linked to policy. Equally, it could be the environment outdoors within a school. So there is a wide range of ways in which you can contextualize that. And the third option asks you to evaluate the role of the educator in additional learning needs. And again, as we said yesterday, there are different ways that we can contextualise the term educator. So I guess the phrase teacher springs to mind straight away, but equally teaching assistants are also educators. Parents and family members are also informal educators. People who work at youth clubs, for example, or extracurricular activities, we could argue, are also informal educators. So if you choose this one, you'll be thinking a little bit about what impact the teacher or someone else in an educator type role has on learners with additional learning needs, and what might be some of the factors that impact upon the impact that they make. So do they have enough training? Do they have enough support? What impact do their perspectives and attitudes have towards learners, for example? And in terms of the assignment titles, again, I'm aware the terminology is ALN, which is Wales specific. In terms of any of these three assignments, these do not have to be specifically set in Wales. So you can contextualise these to whatever country of choice you prefer. So if your home country is Nigeria or Ghana or Sri Lanka or India or Singapore or the United States, for example, there is no reason why you can't contextualise your assignment within that country and also use the terminology which would be appropriate for that setting. So we also spent a bit of time yesterday then thinking about what you might want to put in terms of answering those assignments, and we suggested then that potentially for your 3,000 words we would be looking at perhaps an introduction of about 150 words, a conclusion of about 250 words, meaning you've got roughly 2,600 words to write the main body of the assignment. In terms of the assignment, again, this will need to be underpinned by references, and a key question that we get asked is how many references is appropriate. In terms of that, there is no one right answer. However, potentially for a 3,000 word assignment, in terms of getting criticality into your discussion, I would suggest that you would underpin this with somewhere between 20 to 30 separate references. So at that point then we asked any questions, and then we moved on to meet some pupils. So on Canvas for this week you will see a link to Meet the Pupils PDF, and on that particular document you will see an outline of different learners that I worked with previously who I've changed their names to Simon, John, Harry, William, Sophie, Charlie, James, Mary and Ryan. And in terms of the amount of time that we had in the session, I suggested we looked at two of these learners, Simon and Mary. Now going through those one-page profiles, you could see at the start of the profile, for example, it talked a little bit about any particular areas of need that these learners had been diagnosed with. So for example, Simon and his diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. It talked a little bit about their interests and strengths, as well potentially as some of the challenges they face within education. And the second half of the profile then was looking a little bit more at their experiences outside of the school setting, in particular what was going on in the home or the family. And in groups you were asked to think a little bit about, but not to post anywhere, for Simon and Mary in particular, what were their educational needs? If you were a teacher working with Simon and Mary, how do you think you would go about supporting both of those learners? Is there anything that you could build on in terms of their interests, for example, in terms of engaging them in the classroom? Are there particular tips or strategies that you're aware of that might be important related to the particular needs that they showed? You were then asked to think a little bit about how some of the home factors might have impacted upon Simon and Mary, and then to think a little bit about who might be involved in terms of supporting these learners. So teachers and teaching assistants and support staff in school would have been involved, but who else do you think might have been involved and for what purpose? And in terms then of both of these learners and the other learners in the pack, I noted yesterday that these learners were all taught together in a group at the pupil referral unit, having been excluded from different mainstream schools for different reasons. And we asked the question at the end, which maybe is a little bit difficult to answer at this point until we focus on the concept of inclusion next week. But did you think that Simon and Mary have been included? We said then that we would pick this up going forward in future sessions, but just to set some context then, we talked about the fact that the terminology in Wales changed in 2021, and up until that point Wales and England together used the terminology special educational needs, and since September 2021 special educational needs in Wales has now moved to new terminology and a new system of additional learning needs. And taking this information from the Welsh Government, for example, they define additional learning needs as follows, and the highlights on this definition are mine rather than what's in the legislation. So a person has additional learning needs if he or she has a learning difficulty or disability, whether that learning difficulty or disability arises from a medical condition or otherwise, which calls for additional learning provision. In other words, if the learner's needs are not being met by what the school is doing to support learners generally, and they need some form of additional or extra or different provision, then the terminology and definitions suggest that that learner has additional learning needs. Again, just to set a bit of context, the number of learners with additional learning needs in Wales has fallen over the last 3 years, where these are the most up-to-date figures. So in 2021, for example, in April, so just before we moved towards the new ALN system, there were just over 92,500 pupils in schools in Wales who had an additional learning need or special educational need, which equated to 19.5% of all pupils and schools in Wales. So roughly 1 in 5 pupils in schools in Wales at that point in 2021 had an additional or special educational need. When we look at this figure then a year later, so roughly 6 months on from the change to the ALN system, we can see that this figure had fallen to 74,661, and the proportion of pupils had dropped to 15.8%. In January 2023, we can see this has dropped again by over 11,000 pupils to 63,089 pupils, which equated to 13.4% of all pupils. So a drop of nearly 19,500 pupils over that 2-year period. So we will pick up next week as to why that is the case. Are there less learners with needs in schools in Wales than there were previously? Or is this due to, in some way, the changes in the system? Or is it due to schools having a better grip on supporting learners with needs, for example? So we will have a go at unpicking that in week 2. Also, we looked at this slide very briefly, and again I'm aware that many of you come from outside of Wales and the UK, so the names of these local authorities in Wales aren't going to mean an awful lot to you. However, just to show on this table on the left hand side, for example, that there are differences in terms of the number of learners who are categorised as having an additional learning need across different parts of the country. So we can see, for example, a low of only 6% of learners in the Rhondda Cynon Taf area of Wales, which is a relatively economically deprived area, compared to 19.6% in the Isle of Anglesey up in the north of Wales, for example, or 21.6% in Powys, which is a very rural region in mid-Wales. So why do we have these differences in terms of patterns of the number of learners who are identified identified as additional learning needs? Are there less learners with needs in Rhondda Cynon Taf compared to Powys, or are there differences in, for example, how learners are supported in schools in these different local authorities? We also very briefly introduced what the most high incidence areas of additional learning needs are in schools in Wales. In other words, what areas of needs have learners been identified and assessed as having. And we can see, for example, speech, language and communication difficulties. So over 22,000 learners in Wales been assessed as having difficulties in that area. 21,500 students roughly having needs classed as behavioural, emotional or social difficulties. And then we've got areas like autism, just under 10,000, ADHD, just under 3,000, and dyslexia, just under 5,500, for example. So it gives us some idea as the range of different areas of need that teachers in schools in Wales are supporting. Next week then we are going to start to consider some different debates in relation to potential issues to both inclusion and also additional learning needs. And as we can see at the bottom of the screen, there is no one right answer. Many of the things that we're going to talk about next week have been debated and argued going right back to ancient Greece and the introduction of education, and we will think next week about what we mean by and how do we do inclusion. So we said yesterday we've probably all got an idea of what we mean by inclusion. However, one of the challenges that we have as educators and as a society is that there is no one standard definition that everyone agrees with. In other words, this can be contextualised in different settings, and that then leads to inconsistencies and differences in practice. So, for example, within a school, a teacher in one classroom might consider inclusion to be this, which informs their practice. However, a teacher in a different classroom might consider inclusion in a different way. And we also see inconsistencies and differences in terms of what schools do in comparison to each other. We will start to think a little bit about what is the purpose of education. So again, as we said yesterday, we send our children to school for 11, 12, 13 years. Why do we do that? We are also engaged in continuing education ourselves as adults. Again, what is the purpose? What is it we want learners to get out of education, and who says that's appropriate? And then we'll start to think a little bit about labelling. We'll start to think a little bit about the impact of perceptions and how these perceptions inform our practice with learners. And if we have time, we'll start to think a little bit about the identification, assessment and support for learners. And a key feature of the new ALN legislation in Wales, which is listening to and acting upon the voice of the learner and families. So what is it that you need to do before next Monday? So I said yesterday that I am aware that you've got different modules going on, and you've also got other things going on in personal and work life outside the module. So I will try and keep tasks to a minimum. So if by next week you take a quick look through the module handbook and the assignment briefs, which are in more detail on Canvas, if you have any questions, then please raise those in the session next week. You might also want to take a look at the remaining Meet the Pupil profiles and again consider what are their challenges in school, what's going on in their home life, and how you might work to support their inclusion in the classroom. So thinking about some of those learners, they are perhaps at some of the extreme ends of the spectrum in terms of the needs they show and the behaviours they exhibited. However, all those learners were all together, different ages, different areas of need in one classroom at the same time. So thinking about inclusion, thinking about the role of the educator, thinking about the environment learners are taught in, there may be things there that you want to take forward and link into researching further in terms of that essay assignment. I've also put up a discussion activity on Canvas, and in terms of that discussion activity, there is no expectation that you have to get engaged with this. However, I will put a discussion activity up every week if you want to post something on there. And finally, there are a couple of readings and links to websites such as UNESCO, for example, on Canvas, which gives information about debates around inclusion and practice. So again, you may want to start to take a look at some of these things in terms of informing what we're going to take a look at next week. Finally then, and again thank you for those of you who filled this in yesterday, there was an opportunity to give a bit of brief feedback in terms of what you thought about the module so far. So did you understand what the module was about? Did you have enough information at that point yesterday to be aware of what the assignment is asking you to do, and also whether you thought the assignment was going to, the module was going to be useful in terms of your needs moving forward. And then we finished off on this slide, which many of you had seen before, but I think this is a really nice quote from Albert Einstein, which sets out a lot about inclusion. Everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it is stupid. And we will pick this up again more next week in terms of considering inclusion, purposes of education, and how we may best support, assess and teach learners with additional learning needs. So thank you for listening to my croaky voice on this PowerPoint. Any questions, please just get in touch, and I look forward to seeing you next week on Monday, the 5th of February. Take care, have a good week, and I'll see you soon.